This is our final project on substance abuse and emerging adulthood by Micah Santoni, Francisco Morales, Jack Medine, and Samuel Madur. Introduction to Emerging Adulthood and Substance Abuse. Emerging adulthood is defined as emerging adulthood has been proposed as a new life stage between adolescence and young adulthood, lasting roughly from ages 18 to 25. There are five features that make emerging adulthood distinctive: identity exploration, instability, self focus, feeling in between adolescence and adulthood, and a sense of broad possibilities for the future. Emerging adulthood is important because it's a young stage in someone's life where they can make huge decisions that will define them as a person and what they want to do. It's important to make the right decisions during emerging adulthood because there are endless opportunities for what one can become, and you only want success for someone. Substance abuse. Substance abuse is characterized by pattern of using a substance that causes distress or problems. These problems can be legal trouble, financial issues, harming relationships, and health issues. Young people are often at risk to these issues because of genetic vulnerability, environmental stressors, social pressures, personality, and psychiatric issues. Oftentimes, people know a person that has been affected by substance abuse. Substance abuse is currently running rampant in America, and it is a problem that has affected almost everyone, whether it is in their own life or it is in someone that they know's life. It is important to tackle this issue, and to do that, you must understand what causes substance abuse and what the definition is. Without knowing what the problem is, how can you solve it? Now, you may be asking yourself, why are emerging adults at risk for substance abuse? According to Davis, during emerging adulthood, use of drugs and alcohol is statistically normative. This is due to a variety of factors influenced by characteristics of emerging adulthood. This can be due to peer influence, identity exploration, and independence. These factors contribute to an emerging adult being more vulnerable to substance abuse. As described in the first slide, being an emerging adult, you have a lot of new independence, and you are trying to find yourself as a person. This can lead to identity exploration, which is a good thing for someone to go through. But when alcohol and drugs combines with this, it can often lead to a rocky road. On the right, you see three friends here drinking alcohol. Later, we will discuss the dangers that alcohol poses, but society has made it so normal for doing drugs and alcohol that people can often be socially pressured into doing drugs and alcohol, which combines with their identity exploration, which is why emerging adults are at such a risk for substance abuse. It is really important.
Right. For my part of the assignment, I focused on the causes and risk factors that lead to drug addiction. Um, so contrary to belief, and what I kind of found as I dove deep into this was that biological and genetic factors play a large role in substance abuse and how and why people turn towards drugs. Um, so a lot of it comes from genetic predisposition. Studies from the National Institute on Drug Abuse um, found that 40 to 60% of addiction susceptibility is inherited. Individuals with a long history of substance abuse disorders, or even just one generation back, have a significantly higher risk of developing similar issues. Another thing was that certain genetic um, structures were found to also increase the likelihood of addiction, such as variations in dopamine receptors. Those are super highly linked to an increased addiction susceptibility. Another big factor was inherited behavioral traits, including impulsive behaviors, thrill seeking, and poor emotional regulation. All these things kind of lead back to being more vulnerable towards turning to those kind of stuff, especially if you grow up around it, you know. Uh, that's not to say that genetics play are the primary role. Addiction is not purely hereditary. Environmental influence also interact with these genetics predispositions to shape the outcomes of what happens. Another thing I found was that brain development and substance abuse also plays a large role. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, critical thinking, and decision making, is not fully developed until mid to late 20s. And an immature prefrontal cortex leads to a weaker self-regulation and higher tendency to risk-taking behaviors. The underdevelopment of the brain's executive functioning systems makes it harder for emerging adults to assess long-term consequences of substance abuse. Research has shown that early exposure to substances can permanently alter brain development, increasing the likelihood of addiction later in life. So just going off of that, obviously the topic of this class is emerging adulthood, and being that we're all mostly under 25 years old, this is huge in terms of substance abuse, you know, because our brains aren't fully developed. We are more inclined to take these thrill-seeking activities or, anything along those lines. And those play a role later on in determining how vulnerable and how susceptible we are to these substances that we're surrounded by. The next slide. We also found that neurochemical influences play a role, a huge role actually, in substance abuse. Um, the brain's dopamine system, for example, which controls pleasure, motivation, and the reward system, is highly susceptible to chemical influences. And drug and alcohol artificially elevate dopamine levels, creating a strong reinforcement cycle that encourages continued use. So that kind of says that, once we do it once, because we create a cycle where we're constantly looking for that first fix. And over time, chronic substance abuse reduces natural dopamine production, leading to dependency and withdrawal systems. So this further exacerbates the issue. Because we if you exhaust all your dopamine levels, then it leads in turn to seeking back to return to normal levels. This process is known as neuroadaptation, which makes it increasingly difficult for individuals to experience pleasure from natural rewards, leading to a cycle of increased substance reliance. So yeah, and then for the next one, I did some research on environmental and social influences. The role of peer influence in substance abuse is huge, especially at this stage in our life, emerging adulthood. Um, because we're surrounded by so many social opportunities here in college, um, it almost becomes normalized to take substances and just use it as a way of passing the time. Even something like just binge drinking on a Tuesday for St. Patty's or something, it all has an effect later on, as we talked about with the biological factors that influence long-term abuse. Um, and another funny thing that I found out, which I honestly experience a lot, is FOMO, which is spelled FOMO. It's defined as the fear of missing out and the desire for social acceptance. It's super prominent at this day and age because there are so many social opportunities. So sometimes it's hard to say no. And when we do say no, you almost feel a little left out and alienated from the friend group. And because, we're all from different places and we want to be accepted at the end of the day. So it kind of makes sense. Studies have also shown that individuals who spend time in high-risk social environments are more likely to develop long-term substance dependency, which is kind of what I just talked about. Another big one that we don't really talk about is the social media platforms glorify excessive alcohol and drug abuse. Obviously, our generation grew up with social media, and there's videos everywhere of people doing just memes of people doing funny things while they're intoxicated, and this kind of reinforces a bad habit of acting out and wanting to go out and drink. Um, another one, another environmental influence could be your family and your upbringing. Your family and your upbringing. Um, a household where substance abuse is normalized obviously increases the likelihood of you doing drugs and alcohol. Um, when you're exposed to it, you just become familiarized and almost desensitized to the fact that it has these long-term effects that are often ignored. In terms of family, a lack of parental supervision if your parents are on substance abuses also plays in that just because there's an inconsistent discipline or exposure to the risks of domestic substance abuse. Um, Another one could be economic and educational stressors. Many emerging adults at this point in our lives, we face financial struggles, student loan debt, and job instability, increasing our stress levels. Um, a lot of this stuff can just lead to, finding gratification in things and increases our likelihood of trying to self-medicate to kind of drown out our everyday anxieties. So, that obviously plays a huge role. Um, the misuse of prescription stimulants is also a big thing. I know like a lot of people I know who aren't prescribed Adderall, Retinol, they take it for finals, and almost becomes a baseline for every finals, and it makes it more accessible, and you're more likely to do it because you've already did it once. It also just creates a lack of. It also just creates a cycle of irresponsibility and feeling that you need it even though you don't. Um, for my last section, I focus on the psychological and behavioral risk factors. So this is a little different than the other two ones or the other ones, because it focuses on it's very person to person. The first one being mental health disorders and substance abuse. There's a strong correlation between mental health disorders and substance abuse disorders. Individuals with depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder are significantly more likely to engage in substance abuse. Many people use substances as a form of self-medication. However, these substances often worsen medical health conditions over time. Um, I kind of see this, people who struggle with anxiety and depression often feel that their only escape would be through substance abuse. So this obviously isn't a good thing, but that's just kind of what I found and what I've seen throughout my college days. Um, Another one is risk taking and impulsivity behaviors. Um, being an emerging adult, we're kind of surrounded by all these opportunities to explore and we have this newfound independence, and it makes us more likely to take risky decisions. Um, Studies indicate that young adults with higher impulsivity scores engage in more frequent binge drinking and illicit drug use. Um, I feel like also this can kind of relate to how, peer pressure and how we feed off each other. If your friend's likely to go out and drink, you're gonna go out and drink, or if your friend's likely to drink and I don't know, do something exciting and thrilling, you're most likely to also partake in it. My last point would be um, people use substance abuse as a form of coping mechanism. Many young adults turn to substances to escape emotional distress, social traumas, or social or pressures. Early life adversities, such as childhood trauma or neglect, are major predictors of substance dependency. Without if developing these healthier alternatives to drugs, people often go down a downward spiral where they develop a bad relationship with substances. Um,
So now we're going to get into some of the consequences of substance abuse within emerging adulthood. First, we're going to look at the long and short-term health risks that substance abuse poses. In terms of the short term, some statistics that we found very alarming. First of all, 50.1% of young adults reported drinking alcohol in the past month, which contributed to impaired decision making. Obviously, when you are under the influence of alcohol, it can cause you to make decisions that you wouldn't typically make when you're sober, such as driving when you're not in the correct state to. It could also lead to overdose and poisoning. 14.4% of young adults misuse prescription drugs in the past year. And when you are misusing these prescription drugs, that can obviously increase overdose risk. There are also immediate cardiovascular and neurological effects, such as increased heart rate, high blood pressure, dizziness, and blackouts. There are also mental health impacts, and we'll get into those a little bit later, more in depth. But for now, in the short term, substance abuse can lead to increased anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations with substances such as marijuana and other stimulants. And obviously, kind of, the deeper you get into substances, the stronger the substance is, the stronger the mental health and obviously other impacts that can occur. In terms of the long term, 15.1% of young adults met the criteria for alcohol use disorder. There is also cognitive decline associated with substance abuse. In terms of marijuana, use in young adults is linked to memory loss and reduced attention span. In terms of mental health disorders, 46% of individuals aged 18 to 25 had either a substance use disorder or a mental illness in 2022. This is incredibly alarming. 46% is a number that we do not want to see linked to this. That is way higher than it should be. So clearly, this is a very large issue for emerging adults. It could also lead to organ damage and weakened immune system in the long term, which are not great at all for someone's personal health. In terms of impact on mental health, relationships, and academic career success, we went over this stat a little bit earlier, but there are 46% of emerging adults in that 18 to 25 range that are experiencing substance abuse or mental illness. There is clearly a link between the two. When you are abusing substances, it can lead to depression, anxiety, psychosis, suicidal thoughts. And that is just not what you want to be having. Substances should not be a crutch to lean on when you are feeling bad, because they can just make it worse and make you feel worse than, what's really going on. In terms of relationships, substance abuse can strain family and social connections. When substances are all you're kind of thinking about and focusing on, and, that's the only thing you want to have. And when you're not having it, and when you are having it, you are just isolating yourself and there's conflict and tension. It's just not a positive thing at all. It can also lead you getting into relationships down the line that are toxic or abusive, or worsening the relationships that you already have. It is a very, very bad thing for relationships. In terms of academic and career success, frequent substance abuse is not great. Like I mentioned before, if it's the only thing you're thinking about, you kind of lose sight of what's most important. It leads to poor academic performance, increased dropout rates, reduced job stability, and it limits your long-term earning potential. These are, very, very strong factors should be taken into consideration when you are abusing substances. It is, not something to play around with. It does have detrimental and long lasting effects on more things than just your physical health. In terms of the potential for addiction and long-term substance dependence, we went over this stat earlier, but young adults who are highly vulnerable to addiction, currently there's over 15% of young adults who meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder, and frequent drug use increases dependence. Also, something to note is the brain changes. We are currently in a developmental phase of our brain. It is still developing and growing, and substances alter your brain chemistry. So when you're abusing them at this young developmental age, it can really have an impact on you in a negative way. It can reinforce cravings, and it can make quitting more difficult over time. Also, with escalation of substances and tolerance of substances, regular use of substances leads to a higher tolerance. When your tolerance is higher, that leads you to, consuming more of these substances to get those same effects that you were getting before. And when you're consuming more and more, that increases the likelihood of all of these consequences that we discussed before, especially overdose and long-term dependence. Substance abuse is not a great thing at all, and there are many, many consequences that are connected to substance abuse.
So the portion that I was assigned to do was prevention and intervention strategies. There's basically just ways that people have come up with to try and help people stop doing drugs and just not to do them at all. So my first slide is, education, policy, and programs aimed at reducing substance abuse. So the first part of it is education initiatives. Schools implement substance abuse prevention programs to help educate their students about the risks and consequences of drugs. There's also awareness campaigns that aim to inform communities about the dangers of substance abuse and promote healthy lifestyles. And parents and community members also receive educational resources to help prevent substance misuse among younger people. The second way that people are trying to help stop the usage of drugs amongst young people is policy measures. Governments are starting to enforce stricter regulations on prescription drugs, and they're penalizing dealers and users, but while also reducing health risks by having things like needle exchange programs, so that when people do use drugs, because they're addicted, it'll at least be safer for them. And then finally, programs for prevention and treatment. There's rehabilitation and counseling services, and they kind of provide support for people struggling with substance abuse. One way is support groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. They offer peer-based assistance for recovery. My second slide is the role of family, schools, and community in prevention. Parents play a huge role in preventing their kids from using drugs at an early age. When parents properly teach their kids the dangers and the risks of using drugs, they're more likely to never get into them in the first place. Schools also play a really crucial role in preventing substance abuse and stopping it. When a school implements prevention programs that educates their students about the risks of substance abuse, it promotes healthy decision making. Teachers and counselors identify at-risk students and provide early intervention and support. And then extracurricular activities and mentorship programs offer positive alternatives to drug use for kids. The community also plays a huge role in prevention. In your community, if there are organizations that create safe spaces for youth, it'll help prevent them from getting into drugs. Local initiatives such as neighborhood watch programs and public awareness campaigns help spread information and resources about prevention to parents. Collaboration between law enforcement, healthcare providers, and social services ensures a comprehensive approach to preventing substance abuse as well. And for my final slide, titled Resources for Treatment and Recovery, including counseling and rehabilitation options. One of the main resources that are available to most people are counseling services. Individual and group therapy sessions kind of help provide emotional support, and they provide coping strategies for individuals recovering from substance abuse. Licensed counselors and therapists help patients address the underlying causes of addiction, because when someone knows the underlying cause of an addiction, it'll help them strategize quitting. And then family counseling services assist loved ones in understanding addiction and supporting recovery efforts. Rehabilitation programs are the second ones. Inpatient rehabilitation centers offer structured treatment plans, medical supervision, and intensive therapy for individuals struggling with substance abuse. These are the rehabilitation centers that require people to go to them. And then there's outpatient ones that are more flexible, and they allow people to go to work still and do day-to-day tasks. And also detoxification programs help individuals like safely withdraw from use instead of just cold turkeying, which is dangerous. And finally, Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous are peer-led support groups. And they're amongst many that are available to people, including online ones. And yeah, that concludes my section of the presentation for substance abuse in emerging adulthood.